And so in terms of sexuality, sexually active kids in our schools, about a quarter of them in high school are sexually active. That top little piece, note it starts at 11, 12, and 13 years old for age of first intercourse, where again are my elementary schools and middle schools. And actually, I just looked at the updated data the other day. It hasn't shifted a whole lot. These are the birth control approaches that they're using. Forced sexual assault by gender. The transgender numbers I looked at again the other day, and I'm happy to report they've gone down actually a fair amount. They're down to I think it's 28.7%. And these are pretty consistent with the national norms. Beyond sexuality, sexual assault, and I've got national data I could share with you. I've got a ton of data. I've looked a lot at student health and wellness initiatives over the last couple of years. In the trend book chapter that I wrote this year, I actually looked very closely at loneliness in our students. So I don't know if you know this, but we're going through a loneliness epidemic in our country. Adults are lonelier than they've ever been, and the kid data is pretty alarming. These are boys and girls loneliness data, and this is them self-reporting to the independent school health check in the last 30 days. Mental health, anxiety, depression, eating disorders. I'm sure you've read boys are blue, girls are orange, trans students are gray. And I'm sure you've read about just the anxiety, depression issues that our students are facing at higher rates than they've ever faced before. Suicide numbers are up across the board, but particularly for middle school girls. So those of you with middle schools, this is an area to pay particularly close attention to. Suicide rates for African American boys have increased something like 74% in the last 15 years. They're another risk category. This is self-harm, suicidal thoughts, self-injury, and self-injury greater than 3 times in the last 30 days. This is pressure data, pressure that students feel. Orange is middle school, that purpley blue is high school. Interesting, when you talk to researchers, they say actually the kids they worry about the most are the ones who are reporting low pressure because it shows total disengagement in school. But this is the data that keeps me up at night. So I don't know if any of you have done the high schooler's day. So the correlation between suicidal thoughts and lack of sleep scares the daylights out of me. And again, this is just independent school students. These are high schoolers. And then, of course, no conversation about student health and wellness would be complete without talking about vaping. Early data from the independent school health check, but they're kind of validating it and they're creating a bigger pool, shows that boys tend to vape just a crazy amount more than girls do. This says 2 times as much. I think his data says 3 times as much. And they're more likely to start smoking if they start. I mean, ironically enough, right, because e-cigarettes actually help adults get off of cigarettes, and for teenagers, it actually helps them start on cigarettes, which just goes to show that teenagers do things backwards. And what do teens say that's in their e-cigarettes? There's bullying data, there's all kinds of data out there on student health and wellness, but almost every school I know of is talking about this right now. A lot of schools that have done strategic plans in the last 2 years, this is way up on their priority list. It's just something really hard for schools to wrap their hands around. People blame technology, they blame social media, and I will say, I mean, how many of you didn't get invited to a party when you were a teenager that all of your friends got invited to? But nobody was streaming you live photos of the event while it was happening. And so I don't think you can totally remove technology from it, but it's not the overall driver going through it. Amada, do you have any comments on any of these?
No, just to let people know that when Debra was still with us at NAIS, we partnered with this professor from Arizona University. And what was, to me at least, eye-opening was the fact that normally when we have conversations around student wellness and health, normally we have specific conversations about low-income students being at risk. But she's the only one that we know who actually has been studying in what she calls high-performing schools, like independent schools, and also some of the local public schools. And she found that our students are also at high risk No, so that is something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah.
And we're going to be releasing also some numbers.
Yeah, so she, her name is Sunia Luther, and you might have seen a lot of articles about her in the Washington Post and some other places. Like, people, I think, are finally been picking up on some of this data and what it means for our students.
Do we feel that the main reason we see all this anxiety, depression, is just social media, or is there other factors that play a role too?
So you can't actually have this conversation without talking about parents.
Yep.
And fascinatingly, she also studies moms, particularly in affluent families, and looking at how their support systems have been kind of eaten away over time, and just the amount of anxiety that parents feel. If you're ever looking for an interesting parent anxiety article, the Atlantic wrote a great piece called The New American Aristocracy, the Top 9%. And it talks a lot about the anxiety that parents feel about their children doing as well or better than them. So the American dream has flatlined a lot over the last, say, 20 years, and it's just getting worse. And so there's a big piece of that it's sort of part of a bigger cultural piece. Sunia would also tell you that there's this feeling that if you've been giving everything, you have no reason to fail. So there is that sort of built-in pressure. Jack?
Are you going to cite Gleason or not? At what cost?
You're welcome to cite Gleason. You are my king of quotes.
Yeah, go on out and buy Gleason's book. It's called At What Cost, Defending Developmentally Appropriate Structures in America's Most Competitive Schools. And so I'm going to tell you this as a head of school. Sure, the parents have something to do with it. Sure, the colleges have something to do with it. And so too do we heads of school. At the request of parents only, or because we want to have the most competitive, the largest, the coolest, the biggest, you name it, athletic program, arts program, science program, STEM program, STEAM program. I've defended them, I've promoted them, I've argued for financing them, and the result is what Gleason says is, this is the result. So if you read any book this year, it's a little bit strong, go read Gleason's book, because it's about America's competitive independent schools. You can't say, oh, that happens at those public schools. He looked at our schools, and he says it's on us, we educators and parents. Best book I've read in the last couple of years on this, I would say. At What Cost?
And his last name is Gleason, Gleason.
Yeah.
And a couple of the different groups that I've been involved with on this front over time, too, is if the kids feel like they have no excuse to fail, and the parents are looking at the college application process with all of the extracurricular lines to fill, do they have any reason to fail their kids by not involving them in as much everything as possible? Let's go launch nonprofits in Uganda or whatever the country is of note right now. And so there's a big pushback on higher education right now saying, okay, really, do we need 3 pages of extracurricular notes? And so Turning the Tide through Making Caring Common has been doing this push. There's a group called Character Collaborative. MIT actually started this a long time ago. Pick 3 extracurriculars. That's it. Show some depth, show some passion, but you only got 3, just to keep the crazy from spinning out of control.
Just quickly, I wanted to add to your comment about what is the role of parents in this research that Sunia Luther is doing for independent schools. She's finding that mother alienation might be a big factor in producing all of these anxiety, depression feelings, but also teacher alienation. And in our opinion, that is an easier fix for us, rather than managing parents. At least in our schools, we can do more work around having supportive teachers.
Yeah, and I just wanted, just so you know, and I'm just double checking my date. Sunia Luther is actually going to do a webinar for SAIS schools on December 10th. And she's going to include a couple schools that she's actually worked with in our membership to talk about what that looked like and sort of the road that they're on to working around this issue. And it's open to any SAIS school, so any of you are welcome to join that conversation. Okay. Robert is in 5th grade and has struggled since he arrived at your school. As you start looking forward to middle school, you know that your school is not the place for him. These are never easy decisions as enrollment is down overall, but you also know that there is another independent school that would be better fit for Robert and can provide him with the learning support that he needs. Robert is the son of the board secretary, who also happens to be one of the biggest donors to the school. Everybody's the biggest donor. What happens? When you sit down with Robert's parents and discuss this issue with them, they assure you that they will coordinate the outside help he needs. You try to explain that this won't work for middle school, and that this is in the best interest of the child. They offer to endow a position for a full-time learning specialist to join your staff to support students like Robert. Now what happens?
Problem solved.
Slam dunk. We have had an incredible increase in the number of learning specialists employed by independent schools over the last 7 years. I actually pulled that data the other day. It's pretty high. What do you watch out for here? Yeah.
Creating a school within a school when that's not your deliberate intent.
Right. If you're mission driven, what are you worried about?
Mission creep.
Mission creep. Yeah. But if everybody else is hiring a learning specialist,
The learning specialist can fit within your existing mission. If it's analyzed and deliberately chosen, that doesn't mean you're school. But what the first paragraph says, it looks like you can't function in your classrooms with pushing help. Right. He needs a school in this school. Right.
this might not end well, right? So they endowed the position, you hired a learning specialist, 12 months later you realize, how's he doing? Yeah, and then what's happened? Now you've got a real problem on your hands. Amada and I want to get to some of the enrollment competition data, but be aware of this. With like 1 out of 5 students now being diagnosed with some sort of learning disability, know that this is coming. We launched actually a resource specialist, sort of a learning support conference last year. We budgeted for 43 people. We ended up with 237. It's in January this year. We already have over 50 people registered for this conference, and it's in January. So this particular topic is hot with our schools right now. And people asking to endow, to fund, to otherwise make it work in your school is a pretty common conversation, because particularly if they're happy with their school, it's a supportive environment for their child, this is a big one. So let's talk about enrollment stressors. We have a good feeling for our current parents. They're delaying life milestones. We're getting into millennials, and Gen Z are starting to come. Their average net worth has fallen by 34% since 1995, just to 2014 alone. They get married later. Birth rate is at its lowest in 32 years. If you've never been born, you cannot be educated. Home ownership has dropped. And this is particularly bad in the Northeast, by the way. South, we're still, somebody told me the other day that we have 3 kids. They're like, oh yeah, 3rd child is a status symbol, which I thought was hysterical. Most educated in history and the most in debt. Student loans now total $1.5 trillion. That's greater than the deficit. Education, food, healthcare, but education is really something else. Cumulative increase in discretionary income for the top 20% versus the bottom 80%. And again, the fertility rate's pretty exciting. Competition. There are more choices than there ever were before. When most of us in this room were children, most of this didn't exist, or if it existed, it was fringe. The homeschooling thing is amazing. How many of you, your states actually have a virtual online school that homeschool parents can use with their kids? That's becoming much more prevalent. Charter schools, magnet schools, these sports activities academies, these half-day schools, so that they're really driven parents and kids. The kids only have to go to high school from 8:30 in the morning till 11:30. We have one of those in Charleston. They're opening one in Spartanburg, and I think there's already one in Columbia. It sounds really good on paper. About a year and 18 months later, parents realize their kids aren't necessarily learning a whole bunch. And improving public schools. I have friend who's more compulsive than I am, she actually, where she lives, she went to all of the public schools and all the private schools, and she called me up. She said, you know what I figured out? I said, what's that? She said, they're all using exactly the same curriculum, and their class sizes are not all that different. And she's one of, like, you know, she had the spreadsheet that she shared with me. Amada, decline?
Sure. You know, that when people said in the devil is in the details, whenever we were talking about aggregating numbers, enrollment numbers seem to be okay, right? But when you start looking at individual schools and how enrollment had changed over time, we found 4 different groups. The light green represents those that are reporting enrollment increases during this time period from 2015 to 2019. That is 10% or higher. The purple blue one represents all increases that are between 0 to 10. And one you don't want to be in is in the orange and the red. No? But you can see in all these different regions. Now for NAIS, essentially, 44% of our schools are in this orange and red, meaning that they are losing at least one student in this period. For SAIS schools, you're doing better than the national numbers, is 4 out of 10. And we have different regions. This is when we talk about how the different demographic changes, how the economy is impacting millennial parents in particular, the competition, all of these variables really play a role when you're looking specifically at your market. No, and that's the reason why you see in Charlotte schools, we were talking about that the public school offering is not that strong. Nashville is booming. Every single time I go to Nashville, it seems like there are more and more younger people going there. There are a lot of kids. The economy is still fine. If you compare this with other regions in the country, we were also talking, I think, with Jack earlier, how expensive it is to live in certain parts of the country, like in Silicon Valley, in Seattle, right? So we're seeing people relocating to the south, because housing is still affordable.
And this is where we see, so this is median number of applications. This is the national data. And this is what we see, is we see softening with elementary schools and elementary middle schools. People are tending to wait to invest in high school. And that we've seen pretty universally. Like when I go to a K-8 school and they're like, oh no, actually our numbers are killing it. I went to one a few weeks ago, and and I pulled all the data and the school's data relative to that, and I said, this is amazing. Like this, you should congratulate yourself, because it's pretty difficult to get these numbers now. And then this is the enrollment change over that same time period. This is forecasted growth in high school graduates from 2012 to 2032. And you see in the South, we're tending to do pretty well. So these are good numbers to sort of track. I want to hit affordability quickly. This is change in average household income 2010 to 2016. And this is discount rate. Amada, do you want to speak to the discount rate a little bit?
Sure. What happened, especially after the recession, is that we saw a change on financial aid. Many of our schools started to assign financial aid towards families who before used to be full pay. So essentially what is happening with independent schools is the same phenomenon that we're seeing in college and higher ed education. The sticker price is X, but most of us have revamped their financial aid numbers. So the actual money that is being paid is lower. And just in looking at the numbers for budgets, financial aid adjusted for inflation in the last 10 years has increased by 90 and 95%.
Tuition as a percentage of median income, what's really important to remember when you look at this slide is people's emotional number when investing in education is about 10% of their income. So when you start talking about those magic tipping numbers, so for those of you who are closing in on $20,000, $25,000, $30,000, you need to bear in mind what your income is for your local area, because that's the number that parents in their head, and that's all in. So if you have 3 children, 10% for all 3 kids. Amada?
One of the reasons why we think that enrollment numbers are more positive in the South is because you guys have been better at keeping day tuitions lower than in the rest of the country. But still, after adjusting for inflation, we can see, depending on the area where you are, in Atlanta, for instance, that the gray bars represent 2010 versus the purple 2019. So you can still see how much it has been increasing.
And so this is adjusted for inflation.
This is already adjusted for inflation.
I want to
yes.
clarify that.
during that period.
And I want to point out, so adjusted for inflation, if you run the numbers, say, on boarding school, and my husband loved it when I did this exercise. So when he was in boarding school in 1988, and it was costing about $15,000 a year, if they had just kept up with inflation, it would be about $28,000 a year now, and it's about $60,000. So, and universities are the same way, but we're much more optional. And so this,
Yeah, on average, you have an increase above inflation of mid 30%, right? 35, 32%, depending on where you are.
yeah. And this is something I'm beating on as I travel around the region. We have got to keep this in check. We do not want to look like the bloodletting that is happening in the Northeast. It's not pretty.
And this just speaks about the percentage of students on financial aid. You can also see the orange represents 2010 versus the purple 2019, how we have been increasing the number of students who are on financial aid.
So just a couple more slides. If you haven't played with this website, it's called How Money Walks. And it actually drills into every state, but then it drills into every county. I was in Tennessee Tuesday this week. And so Davidson County, which is actually where Nashville is, it shows, it's obviously red, so they've actually been losing money. And it breaks down where that money has moved. And then if you go to some of the neighboring counties, so if you click on this one, Williamson County, it shows where money is coming from. It's good to be in the South right now, right? So go back to this one. You don't want to be in the Northeast. Jack, I know how much you love California. You don't really want to be there either. But if you look at the South, money's moving in. This can also impact you programmatically depending on where families are coming from. If they're coming from strong public school states, if they're coming from very progressive education states, what do they expect to see when they come to your school? But this is a great website to play around with. I promise if you want to get trustees really interested in what's happening, let them all play with this for about 10 minutes, and they will be going kind of all over the place. And then, of course, we're looking at the potential of this recession coming up. Budget planning is coming up. Everybody's voting on their budgets in December, even if you have some alternative models happening. This is Chinese investments in the U.S. Numbers are way down. Things are softening. I know that there's like a couple, sort of optimistic investment bankers out there. Most of them are not. The inverted yield curve has not switched. And then our service industry, our professionals, so lawyers, doctors, they're seeing softenings in the payouts and distributions in their partnerships. And so you really need to be aware of this, and this is regionally. You really need to be aware that this is impacting our families as you're preparing your next budget. And with that, does anybody have any questions on this front? I know it's such a cheery note, but think about how much better we're doing than some parts of the country. All right, we've only gone 11 minutes over, and I'm feeling pretty good about that. Thank you so much for spending the day with us today, and hopefully we'll see you next time.